Hello, everyone, wherever you are in the world, and thank you for joining us. I am Louise Hosking, President-elect of IOSH, and I will be your host for today's session. IOSH is the world's largest chartered body for health and safety professionals, and I'd like to welcome you all to the second of our three-part IOSH COVID Unlocked webinar series. I'll be joined by three panellists from three of our IOSH sector groups to look at how the hazardous industries, offshore and rural industries have fared during the pandemic, and in particular how these sectors have managed to innovate and set themselves up for a brighter future despite all the challenges of the past year and a half. The strapline for this COVID Unlock series is how fighting the virus today saw us innovate for tomorrow. We're keen to learn how good OSH enables recovery and future resilience, and to look forward to a better world of work for all. The series is driven by members of IOSH sector groups, and last month we saw panellists from the institution's food and drink industries, construction and logistics and retail groups give their insights into how their sectors have been operating during the pandemic. If you missed it, you can view it from the IOSH website. Our next and final session of this mini-series will take place on Thursday, the 24th of June, and will involve representatives from the education, environmental waste management, health and social care and public services groups. So how have the sectors we're going to hear from in today's webinar found ways to succeed and build at least a manageable COVID as usual, if not yet a post-COVID future? And how have OSH professionals from these sectors helped to keep businesses safe and their workers safe? Critically, how might success in the face of COVID be translated to other sectors? How can OSH people learn from the struggles and achievements of fellow professionals working in different, more diverse environments? I'm delighted to be joined today by three highly regarded OSH experts, but before I introduce them, I just wanted to highlight that you may all have noticed we have enabled transcripts for this session. If this is distracting in any way and you do not wish for them to be there, you each have the ability to remove them by clicking to disable these subtitles. So, on to our introductions, and as I call out your name, it would be great if you can turn your videos on. So first of all, let me welcome Tom Chambers of the Hazardous Industries Group. Tom is a chartered member of IOSH and is currently the Group SHE Manager for Terminals, a bulk liquid storage company that includes 2 COMA lower tier series facilities. With extensive multi-sectorial experience as a safety professional, Tom has been involved in heavy engineering, fast-moving consumer goods, high and low food manufacturing, and the animal feeds and cereal sector. So welcome, Tom, today. Next up, from the Offshore group, I'd like to introduce you to Trevor Stapleton. Trevor is a civil engineer, holds a master's in construction engineering and an MBA from Aberdeen Business School. He is also a chartered safety professional and a practitioner member of IEMA. With over 36 years of industry experience, he has spent most of that time with BP, where he's acquired a range of skills in the areas of HSE, supply chain, engineering and operations management in their downstream and upstream businesses. Trevor, good to have you on the panel. And finally, we have Tina Morgan, who is from the Rural Industries Group. Tina is a chartered member of IOSH and the chair of the IOSH Rural Industries Group. She's been working in risk management for around 18 years. Tina, great to have you on the panel too. So it's great to have everybody with us, and without further ado, I'm going to jump straight into the first questions. And from my perspective, it's just great to have this range of sectors in front of us today. And I think even though we work in different environments, I'm sure that we're going to find that we have a lot in common too. So Tom, I'm going to start with you. If you could just tell us a little bit more about your role, and what have been the biggest challenges for you during this time, and what have you done differently, if anything? What's really stood out for you in all of this time? So Tom, over to you. If you could unmute.
Well, Louise, as you said on the opening introduction, I'm responsible for 8 terminals, predominantly based in England, receiving cargo worldwide, and some of that's animal feed, some of it will be technical chemicals, some of it will be oils, fats, and greases. A lot of that is for animal feed sector. Now, one of the challenges that we faced early on is ship-to-shore communication. The officers, no problem at all with English, even though it wasn't necessarily their first language. But of course, the crew members, a lot of that is their native. They're working in their native tongue, and of course, with social distancing in mind, we had to come up with ways of keeping our crews, their crews, separate from our particular operators, and it involved an increase in the use of communications, particularly email. Now, the issues there really is that most of the ships are chartered. You've got to go through the ship brokerage companies to try and make contact with the ship. They're wondering who's trying to make contact with them, because they come into the port network, and then traditionally we would have gone on board the ship, we would have done the ship-to-shore checklist, and then we'd start a discharge. So we had to make sure things like the ISCOT ship-to-shore checklists were done by email. And a lot of that higher technology was also, we used low-tech ideas as well. I mean, little things like handing the ISCOT checklist over in a bucket. So put it on the floor, step back, somebody picks the bucket up, deals with the paperwork, hanging it over the side, people picking it up and then dragging it back up the side of a ship. So we've managed to overcome it, and to some extent, to a large extent, we've completely managed to maintain social distancing during that period. And bear in mind, these ships are coming in barges, coasters from all over Europe and all over the world, especially from what the government are currently calling red-listed countries. So that we've overcome that, and we've moved on really, and it's worked really well for us.
Fantastic. Well, perhaps we'll explore a few of those points a bit deeper on as we continue in the conversation. So Trevor, same for you, if you could just give us a little bit of an overview of what your role encompasses, and what some, a couple of your biggest challenges have been in all of this.
Okay, so thanks, Louise. So I'm the HSE director for OSHA UK, and we represent really the interests of all our members that are working in the offshore sector, the North Sea offshore sector. And that will also include liaison with the regulator, so both HSE and OPRID on the environmental side, but also, as my experience over the last 18 months, quite a lot of contact with government, both UK and Scottish government, very much all around the COVID issues. I think I think the question was what some of the major problems. Well, we had countless major problems. I think one that stood out for me was around helicopter operations. You have to realise, I mean, those that have not worked in an offshore environment, there is no bus that's going to turn up every hour on the hour and things like that. We get to and from using helicopters. That's our main means of transportation, or transporting the individuals offshore and then back onshore. And when COVID first took off, we were challenged. It's fair to say that at the very early days in April last year, we were close to shutting down, I would say, the North Sea, and that would have meant UK energy needs just ending there and then. And that was because of helicopter operations, and we had to look at, so how can we protect the pilots? How can we protect the passengers and reduce the transmission risks on the helicopter? And also, how do we protect everyone in a heliport? And specifically in helicopters, we introduced, there were screens to sort of keep the pilots and co-pilots separate from the passengers. We reduced numbers. So typically on a helicopter, you're talking something like around, say, 17 people on a helicopter any one stage. And then we also had to wear, we were talking about face coverings. And you think that that was very easy. Yeah, face coverings, just do it. But when you go on a helicopter, you have to, you're like a Michelin person, if you like. We've got our survival suits on, we've got our escape sets on. And if you can imagine that in the event of a ditching, an emergency situation, you've got to make sure you've got to get your emergency escape kit, you've got to get the mouthpiece into your mouth, and you've got to make sure that you locate where's going to be your exit from the helicopter. And then you can then add that. Can you imagine what it would be like if you were wearing, say, an FFP3 mask around your face that's tied at the back of your head, etc., and the panic that would ensue if you're trying to get that off. So we decided that you couldn't use standard face coverings, you couldn't use FFP3's mask. So we went for a face covering, so it's a snood. Very simple, because the other concern is if you started wearing just a standard face mask, when you get out of the helicopter, there's a good chance that it would blow off and it would get sucked into the engine intakes, which you don't want that to happen to a helicopter. So we wore, we recommended a snood. We went out and sourced snoods. We then, you go and use the, we got the support of one of the survival companies, training companies. So they got their team trying out the snoods and the face masks, etc. And then we've got approval from the Civil Aviation Authority to wear that. So that's what you'll find now, and it was consistent. That was the one thing. Trying to get consistency across the North Sea is always a challenge. But we did that. If you go offshore now, everyone will be wearing a snood. It's very easy to pull off, and it stays on your head basically, or it stays around your neck, so it's not going to go anywhere. So something as simple as that ensured the protection or safety of the people on the helicopter. And then the final thing we did is we had a categorization of helicopters. So if it was category A, that was a normal crew change. And if it was category D, it would be a search and rescue helicopter, an emergency situation. And there we had our search and rescue helicopters had sort of almost like a biosphere inside, so you could put people inside it. And then we had two categories in between. We had a category C, which was suspected. So we thought that you could have had COVID, and therefore you were medevaced back on shore. And then we had the close contacts as well. And that sort of categorization overnight enabled us to continue helicopter operations. And that's been used now throughout the world as a sort of standard for helicopter operations during COVID or during the pandemic. So that was, that was a quick example of some of the problems that confronted us.
Yeah, and I mean, that's when you think of offshore, that isn't kind of the core function that we're talking about, but it's critical that you get everybody on, everybody off, and it just shows the breadth of what health and safety professionals are getting involved in all of this. So that's great. Thanks, Trevor. So Tina, the same question to you, and I think what the common thread through all of you is that actually these are sectors that did not stop working. So Tina, a little bit from you on what's your current role and your sort of key challenges that you've overcome in all of this.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, my current role is I'm employed as an agency manager for an NFU mutual agency, which is based in Mid Wales. But I'm coming at the webinar today mainly in respect of my rural industries role for IOSH, and how the rural industries have fared through COVID-19 and all the issues that brought with it. You're absolutely right. Similar to the other two industries that we've just been looking at, most people in agriculture were classed as key workers, so they carried on. They had to. There were reports of food starting to rot in fields and things like that, and it was very much in the public eye at the outset. Unfortunately, not all rural industries fared as well, and not all rural industries were classed as key or essential. And as such, some of them literally just closed overnight, weren't able to continue operating at all. They weren't seen as essential, and that included some industries that you would have thought would have needed to carry on. So conservation and charitable conservation work, a lot of that ceased as well. But the farmers, they're a resilient bunch, and they do try and keep going. And from that point of view, the problems that they really saw and that the industry experienced was quite a lot around getting the food out of the fields and looking after their livestock. Agriculture in the UK relies heavily on migrant workers and workers coming from Europe, and we just couldn't get them in. We could not get them into the UK. So that was one of the first challenges that they had to start looking at overcoming, was how do we get the produce from the field to the shops? That was a real problem. Things like not being able to access statutory testing, getting engineers out to test their equipment and maintain it and keep it running. Things like not being able to get hold of the PPE. So it was great that the government managed to get suppliers quickly on board that could produce face masks. But unfortunately, all of the supplies that our farmers and those in rural industries, including arboriculture, forestry, all those sorts of industries would normally have been using, were prioritised for the NHS. And we just couldn't get it. And what we could get, unfortunately, quite often was being shipped in. It wasn't CE marked, it wasn't of a good enough quality, and it wasn't providing the protection. So that was another problem we had to overcome. And then finally, things like lack of trainers and lack of occupational safety and health professionals to be able to help the farmers to move forward, to be able to plan. And like I say, I'm focusing quite a lot here on farmers and agriculture, but the whole of the rural industries had to adapt, and they had to adapt quickly. And we'll hear a bit further on when I talk a bit more. They did a brilliant job of doing so, but there were challenges to overcome.
And Tom, just to skirt around back to you again, Tom. So you talked a little bit about technology, and I think somebody has already put in the chat, you know, sometimes the best solutions are the simple solutions. So kind of a bit of both ends. You've started to talk about technology and how you've embraced technology. Could you expand a little bit more about that and say how, you know, you found new ways of using technology in all of this, and perhaps a core couple of pieces that you can share?
Well, one of the challenges for us as a sector, not just as a company, is that we do have an aging workforce. You've only got to take one look at myself, getting a bit long in the tooth. But we innovation and technology, there has been a positive spin from that, or a positive byproduct, should we say, in that some of the employees that we've had to ask to use technology might not even have been interested, never mind been able to switch on a PC. It was just, social media didn't exist when they were coming through the system. But one of the benefits that we've seen is a greater adoption of modern technology by people who we wouldn't normally ask to use it. One of the downsides of technology really was the overuse of technology. Whereas people would have picked the phone up and said, can you do X, can you do Y, can you use Z? Now all of a sudden you're in the middle of a particular project and you get a Zoom request pop up because it's cheaper, it's quicker, and it's convenient for the person making that particular request. But I do believe that the overuse of it is very similar to the early days of email. Instead of picking the phone up and asking a question and communicating verbally, there's a lot of use of Teams, Zoom, and other social media platforms, which don't know whether everybody else feels this way, but I just find it a little bit too impersonal. You don't build those relations as well as you could do. But as I say, the positive side of that has been more people adopting technology, whether they want to or not. And I think that's the positive side of the, or a positive side of COVID-19.
So you were, just before we came on air, you were just chatting about that you thought that your teams quite liked you being on the other end of the Zoom. Do you want to just expand on what we were talking about? Because you're not in the same space and not overhearing the conversations.
Yeah, as I say, I think the whole thing really focuses on the fact that some people are much more comfortable with the technology. Some people have grown into the technology quite quickly, and some people have been forced into that technology in order to continue to operate. And the comfort factor isn't there for everybody. And sometimes they get left behind a little bit, and they can go into a little bit of a shell. I think that's what you're alluding to, is it not, Louise?
Yeah, and you were saying that you when you overhear a conversation in the work environment, you think, oh,
right.
have a look at that.
Yeah, well, I'm one of the people in the business who likes being in the office. Some older safety advisors would say a good safety advisor is a gossip and a plagiarist who listens to everything and reads everything and makes use of everything that's available. But you do get those informal conversations that take place. You can be, I mean, operations would say, by all means, Tom, stay in working on Zoom and don't come and bother us. But you can pick up little snippets of information that you might not get unless you are actually mingling with contractors, operators, supervisors, and they do move around between terminal to terminal as well. So you can pick up bits of information which maybe you wouldn't have picked up if you haven't had that types of interaction with people.
I couldn't agree more. And Trevor, over to you. Same question to you around the use of technology.
Yeah, so whether you would say it's new, or I know the questions around new technology, and some might say, well, no, we already have that. Yeah, we have that already. But I'd point to three examples that we were sort of using in the offshore sector. I think first of all, it was around testing. So within about 3 months, we're going back when this kicked off sort of April last year. So within about 3 months, a lot of the offshore operators were doing some form of testing. So you'd go and it would be pre-mob. So we worked very hard with the scientific advisors from Public Health Scotland and Public Health England, because there was a challenge about, because we were testing asymptomatic, we were doing asymptomatic testing. So we were the first probably to sort of lead on that, and we were being told, oh, you shouldn't really do an asymptomatic test. That doesn't definitely prove. And we knew that there were gaps in it. There were risks, because all what asymptomatic testing does is tell you that at the time of testing you didn't have COVID. But we introduced pre-mob asymptomatic testing for the workforce. Then that morphed into offshore. We have point of care test machines offshore. And then moved into lateral flow tests as well that we could use, but we're still doing the pre-mob PCR testing, and that's proved a sort of lifesaver for us. And funny enough, now you'd hear that, oh, asymptomatic testing is available for most people now across the UK. But certainly our industry was leading on that, despite the resistance from the scientific advisors at the time. So there was things like that. There was, although this wasn't necessarily welcome with open arms, but the regulator. So the regulator had a job to do, but the regulator at the same time recognised that they shouldn't be going offshore. So they studied up the concept of virtual regulator inspections. And they, funny enough, have proved probably more intense than the actual visits by the inspector offshore. But they've certainly enabled, if you like, the likes of the HSE to be able to demonstrate that they are doing their job and they are maintaining, because they are the sort of, if you like, the conscience of major accident hazard performance offshore. And then finally, in the similar vein, given that we've got this technology and we're all used to it, we're very keen on, and everyone has signed up to what's known as the Principles of Process Safety Leadership, which, funny enough, had their origins from downstream after the Buncefield incident. But offshore sector has adopted those. And this is about leaders. One of the requirements was for leaders to be visible and leaders to be able to get certainly offshore. And it was great to see that a lot of use was made of technology to ensure that town halls were maintained, so that leaders could demonstrate, or show their presence to big audiences offshore, dealing with the safety reps offshore, using, talking to those using the technology. So this, although sometimes offshore would like to remain outside, out of mind, and keep onshore away, it did enable this continuing communication going. So I think that was the sort of great use of their technologies and challenging science at the time around testing.
Yeah, no, some really great points there. It's interesting what you were saying about asymptomatic testing, and I think I've spoken to a variety of health and safety professionals across different sectors, and after they'd done their risk assessment, that was something they brought in, and you've just highlighted that really well there. So yeah, Tina, the same question to yourself. Farming and technology, or rural industries and technology, I should say.
Yeah. Well, a lot of it does revolve around that, doesn't it? And yeah, a lot of people would sometimes say what that it isn't the first industry you think of when you think of technological advances, but there've been some really huge leaps forward, particularly in the last 12 months. They've really worked hard to try and find a different way of doing things. And some of the things that obviously I've seen coming through the group and through people that I've worked with in the past when I was doing risk management on farms and with rural industries. So drones, and I know that the other sectors have found a big increase in these. So being able to use drones to carry out surveys has been really good. If anything, the problem has been getting hold of drone operators because everyone has wanted them. They've been really in demand. There's been a big move forward in respect of autonomous vehicles as well in agriculture. So GPS driven vehicles, so they can just put the coordinates in and a field can be planted using autonomous planters, automatic planters, harvested using GPS tracked harvesters. Which have proven to be really great as well, because you don't need the actual manpower that you need. You still need someone to be sat in it, but you don't need quite as much manpower behind it. Things like automatic feeding systems for cattle, robotic milkers. So they've been growing steadily over the last few years, but the demand has become more during COVID, and the industry is reacting to the need to adapt and adopt technology. Other things that we've seen, quite futuristic, exoskeletons have been tested in things like horticulture fresh produce growing. You know, they're out there like RoboCop, and it's brilliant because it's not something that we would have probably seen move forward quite as quickly. But yeah, every time I see one, I just think RoboCop, which I love the idea of. And then just down to the everyday things that Trevor and Tom have both mentioned, things like using Zoom, Teams, video calling to be able to carry out surveys, to be able to use Teams and Zoom to do training, induction training, things like smartphone apps to help with inspection of machinery and equipment, and also things like lone worker apps to keep a track of their employees and know where they are and be able to keep an eye on them. And one of the great things, as I mentioned, first of all, not being able to get hold of this migrant labour was pretty much overnight. You know, sites were set up to match labour to farms. So UK labour being matched to UK farms that needed help. And that was initially not the best, it didn't succeed straight away, but they persevered and they were able to put quite a lot of people in place to help UK labour who had probably been furloughed get into UK employment. So yeah, we've used a mix of technology, driving forward, and also the existing systems that were already there.
So it's just to stay with you for a minute, Tina, is in your sector, you're going to have a range of different types of businesses, and you're going to have, you know, very large businesses and small family-run businesses. Have you seen that there's, you know, that it's been equal across all? How have the smaller businesses struggle to embrace this technological revolution that we're seeing?
Some of the smaller businesses, to be honest, have adapted better because they don't rely so heavily on external workforces. And so the ones that do only rely on their family and their own immediate environment, it has been a little bit easier for some of those to adapt to. The children have been great in helping them get on these, you know, fancy systems called Zoom and things like that, and they've adapted really well to it. Sometimes it's the bigger businesses that have struggled in the early stages because they will have found more of their employees being furloughed, or they will have found a lot of their people being off shielding, which has been the other problem. And when it's your technology director who's the one who's shielding, that brings in a huge problem immediately all of its own. And being able, literally in the office I work in, we literally bought the last laptops that were on sale the day that lockdown was announced. And within about 3 hours, we managed to get everybody set up with home working and sent them all home with computers. So the smaller businesses sometimes found it easier to adapt than the larger businesses. But I think they've all had challenges and they've all worked to overcome them, really.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And we are starting to get some questions in the chat. So if you are listening live, it would be great to have your contributions and to have your questions. Mohammed said it's really good to use technology for OSH risks, but we have to be careful to find a good balance. I'm going to come to you in a second, Tom, but Neil Catton has said, "You are not old yet, Mr. C. Good to see you and hear your contribution." So that's great. So I'm going to come back to you again now, Tom, and we're starting to talk about people. And you mentioned earlier on that, which is something that I didn't know about your sector, is that it is very much an aging workforce. So, you know, IOSH is all about prevention first and putting people first. So can you know, it'd be great to just have a conversation with each of you around, you know, how your workers have kind of stepped up and contributed in a positive way, and personal challenges that they might have had.
Well, to me, there's been positive aspects out of COVID-19. Prior to the public information campaign that's obviously been driven by COVID-19, similar to those of us who remember the 1960s and 70s campaigns, it's driven a positive aspect towards risk assessment. And I say that because prior to COVID-19, we would all produce risk assessments. We'd all sit down with our workforces and supervisors and managers to develop an adequate and sufficient risk assessment. But so many times now, because of the public information campaign that the governments have driven, people have understood more about health and safety, have understood more about risk assessment. And on several occasions, I've caught people actually reading risk assessments when they haven't been asked to, on notice boards and whatever. And it's because the interest levels there, it affects them directly, especially if you've got people returning to an office environment or a closed work environment. We're somewhat fortunate in the fact that a lot of our operators, although they wouldn't agree with me during the winter, are out in the open, fresh air, able to socially distance. But and we've all heard it, oh, here comes the health and safety manager, hide quickly, you know. But now you're starting to get people ask about risk assessments. They're starting to want to challenge those risk assessments to the extent where, I'll be honest, I've found bits and pieces that I've missed, and the workforce have pointed out to me point A, point B, point C, and I've thought, I'm the health and safety manager. I'm getting a little bit too complacent, you know. So that communication level, that level of interest, that's been a fantastic spin-off. And I'd like to see more public information films, not driven by pandemic, but driven by other needs, such as, we all remember Clunk Click every trip. We all remember the Amber Gambler, and we'll all remember these COVID information videos. But I'd like to think that the innovative use of information and technology or multimedia systems won't stop at the end of the pandemic, or when we've got the pandemic under control. I'd like to see similar campaigns, certainly where the media have got an interest in it, because the media have been very positive in the main. Okay, some of them have criticized about perhaps we should have been better prepared with PPE, and perhaps we should have been better prepared for pandemic planning. But in the main, the media have been positive, and that's had a positive spin on health and safety in general.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think, you know, it's when you do something new, you know, we are the profession that can cut through that noise, and the humble risk assessment absolutely comes into its own. And what you're describing there is great diversity of thought. And when that comes into what we're doing, you know, extraordinary things can happen. So that's great. Thanks. I'm going to come over to you, Trevor, and I am going to start trying to incorporate some of the questions in the Q&A box, so please do keep those coming in. So we've got a question from Michael Robinson, who's talking about offshore workers spending, you know, 14 to 28 days living in very, very close proximity to each other, often from different locations. So what have been some of the key challenges that you've faced around that, Trevor?
Well, that's it. It's just sort of summed it up in a nutshell, the sort of challenge that that faced us. But I think in the early days, you know, so we recognise, and so if you have a look at the industry, what happens straight off. So typically, the industry works on, you know, in any 1 week, about 12,500 people working offshore, you know, over an average week, and that's what it was pre-COVID. That dropped down to about 7,000. So massive change in numbers that were working offshore, but that enabled us to undertake, you know, social distancing offshore. It enabled us to sort of not go into shared cabins. We had single cabin occupancy, and simple things around not everyone piling into the gym and things like that. And then we just changed some of the operating practices offshore. So I remember talking to a control room operator, and the control room operator and the control room is a magnet. Everyone ends up there, either because they're trying to get permits approved, or they just want to talk about the latest football match or whatever. So they're like a magnet, and the CRO is the true magnet. But the individual was telling me, he said, yeah, he couldn't do his day job because constantly people coming in. And then once the COVID changes were brought into being, he said, I sit here on my own. He said, no one comes to talk to me. So that shows how social distancing was working offshore. The permit meetings that everyone used to just go and turn up to, and you'd be crammed into a room, that all stopped, and we only truly had the people that were needed to be there. So there's lots of changes offshore to try and respect the social distancing requirements. Staggered meal breaks. So you're quite right. You could have typically, say 100 people working offshore. So how are you going to feed them? So it's not all piling into the canteen at one time. So staggered meal breaks. So lots of changes offshore. Onshore, as I said, we introduced in the early days, we had temperature screening, we had questionnaires to make sure we know where people were coming from all around the UK. We could take decisions then if someone was coming from a hotspot, and maybe sort of precautions that we might put in. We started introducing the testing, so pre-mob asymptomatic testing. And by and large, that's all those sort of things, the helicopter controls, etc. And then also logistics in terms of safe havens and safe travel. So trying to ensure that the concept of when someone left their home to get offshore, and when they got back, we tried to ensure that was as near as possible a bubble. Now, that wasn't always going to be perfect because people were using public transport and things like that. But we impressed on them the need to wear face coverings, etc., on their journeys, and to try and keep the social distancing. Don't be stupid and don't nip off to the pub and things like that. So all the sort of practical things were introduced. Now, there's an adage that says you need to tell people, if you want to change, you've got to have 3 different ways of telling them. And I'm not saying it was perfect. And we found, there was COVID fatigue, in terms of people starting to get a bit fed up with the control measures and precautions being put in. So we introduced, we worked hard. We worked with a sort of sister organisation, Step Change and Safety, to try and use them to get the message to the workforce and also to the elected safety reps. And we came up with comms material that we could use to sort of educate the workforce. Simple things that you'd think that people would go, oh, surely you wouldn't do that. But we did have one case of basically a camp chef that thought he had symptoms but didn't do anything about it for a week, and then actually came out to be suspected case of COVID, and yet had been mixing with people over that week. So we had to reinforce these simple messages
personal
accountability as well. The companies could do so much, but there needs to be a degree of personal accountability. Mm-hmm. If your partner or someone in your household has had COVID, please do not then just come offshore the next day knowing that you've got that sort of problem. So we had to sort of challenge the personal accountability as well. But the bottom line is, without the workforce, without the support of the workforce, it wouldn't be a lie to say that the UK would be struggling to meet its energy needs. So that hospital that was using ventilators and electricity and stuff like that, that would have been hard pushed if it wasn't for the offshore workforce maintaining their jobs.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great answer. I'm going to come to you now, Tina, and try and combine a couple of questions that have come up in the chat box. One's from Irzad Ahmed. Hopefully I've pronounced that right. And he said, everyone is using different e-forms and different technology. It'd be great if we could combine this. So I'm going to give you a couple of questions. That's my first question. Have you seen some, team working across your sector to try and, how have people supported each other, for example, with something around that?
There's been lots of different communications going on around the sector, and I've seen lots of different things being pulled together to try and help businesses to make good correct decisions. And you're right, there were lots of things that came out in the early days on, you know, what do I need to do? How do I need to do it? And quite a lot of the sectors that I work with are not very tick box led. They don't do checklists, they talk about it and then they do it. So it was something that had to evolve. And you're right, there were lots of different industries using lots of different forms, but trying to come to the same end decision. And I've seen actually quite a lot, and I've been involved with a number of students who have been working on masters and things like that in health and safety, and within our sectors, and especially at the agricultural universities, where they're trying to make the businesses more resilient. The keywords, if you like, that everyone is throwing around is future proofing, and this is one of the things that there's been a lot of work involved with, and through a lot of that research it is managing to bring forward complementary systems that can work not only through rural industries but all other industries. And I think that helps, because then there is a consistency, and we do need consistency. So it is something we've been working towards.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, that's what these sessions are all about, is how can we break down those silos. And Kevin Coleman has said one great thing is that I've been able to attend more of these webinars. So thanks for that, Kevin, and hopefully we're kind of spreading that around. So Tom, if I can come back to yourself, I'm taking questions off the chat box now. So Gorfridi from Tanzania, and hopefully I've pronounced that correctly, he's talking about company vehicles and how you've managed the use of company vehicles where you might, you know, your risk assessments have potentially said, well, you've got to have more than one person in a company vehicle. So Tom, can you respond to that question? And you're on mute at the moment.
What to say about old safety managers and technology and not coming off mute quite quickly enough. We're quite fortunate in that respect. In relation to vehicles, the only vehicles we have are company cars, maybe the odd van. It's throughout the pandemic, it's been restricted to one person, one vehicle, which isn't very environmentally friendly. In relation to vehicle management, one of the problems that we've had to overcome is social distancing with incoming heavy goods vehicle drivers. Now, they're social beasts. They like to socialize like the rest of us, but they've been on the motorway for 4 or 5 hours before, perhaps, coming in to collect product and then going out again. So they're like magnets. They instantly gravitate towards each other, and they're queuing up to get their tare weights, and they're queuing up to get weighed out afterwards. And we've physically had to, in some respects, restrain drivers from wanting to have a chat and how are you getting on, how's the family, before they get back out on the road again. So our relationship with vehicles is slightly different. I mean, we mentioned before, obviously, most of our product comes in by sea, out by road. Sometimes it's in by road, out by sea, or a mixture of both. But that's really how we've managed the situation and the issues that we faced.
Thanks for that. That's great. And thank you to Michael Flampson, who's saying IOSH is a fantastic resource. And because I worked and lived in the Middle East for years, I didn't join, but I'm pleased that he's rejoined. So that's fantastic. Thank you for that, Michael. And I'm going to come back to you now, Trevor. There's loads of offshore questions that are coming in. I like this one from David Burns, which is all around the use of escape craft and Temps Sea. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about that. And another David has asked about accommodation. So yeah, escape craft and accommodation. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about that, Trevor.
Yeah, I was trying to see what the question was exactly for escape craft. I mean, in terms of the accommodation one's easy. In terms of, at the moment, we have tried to keep cabin occupancy down. However, as we start to see an increase in POB, number of people offshore starting to increase, then we need to get back to how we used to work, and that's why we need then the barriers that we're speaking about in terms of asymptomatic testing and lateral flow testing offshore, things like that, and then trying to, if we can possible, have a day and a night, so that you're not, whilst you're sharing a cabin, you're not on at the same time. In terms of the question around the temps, so I'm just trying to see if I can see what the actual question was. I can't quite see it at the moment, but clearly the main means of evacuation from an offshore installation will be via helicopter, and that's what we would try and do in every case. But in the event of that you've got fire, explosion, risk, etc., smoke, and then you probably say no, you can't use the helicopter, and that you're going to have to use attempts to evacuate the installation. And there's lots of work that's going around. Now, I wouldn't say that COVID has affected that in any way. So, we do muster drills, probably do those once a week to get people to, so that you can time how long it's going to take to get people to muster by the lifeboat. At the moment, there's not a big mass entry into the lifeboat just for doing the drill purposes, although the drillers are slightly different. But the main thing we're looking at for temps that's been ongoing since, even whilst during COVID, is familiarisation. So to make sure that people are comfortable, they're confident, because there is a perception that from the early days we did have lifeboat incidents where they, but that's usually because it was during maintenance activities. But the release mechanisms now are a lot safer, and you can put pennants up there to secure so that you don't inadvertently launch the lifeboat. So you can then take people into the lifeboats and get them familiar with what's going on, where they should sit, how they can put their equipment on, or how they can put their harnesses on, and where they could go and find the safety equipment. So there's a lot of familiarisation processes that are in place. But no, there's nothing that's particularly impacted on during COVID. And if we had to escape by attempts, etc., we would escape by attempts, regardless of you've got to balance it. I think thankfully we haven't lost anyone, God forbid, touch wood, through COVID, and yet we've had some tragic examples of how we've lost people through a major incident. So I think you've got to be a bit more pragmatic in this situation.
Yeah, it's about priorities, isn't it? And if an emergency is happening, you're going to respond to that, definitely. So I'm going to take one last question, Tina, for you from the chat box, and then I'm going to come round and speak to you all about your positives that you're going to take away from this time. So Tina, there's a question in the chat box from Mirza around if all around sort of catering services, and this is a bit like Trevor's issue around pinch points. So there's some parts of operations where you have to have people in very close proximity, and I'm thinking about potentially lines where we're processing food and that kind of thing. So what challenges have you faced in respect of those?
So there were challenges, and a little bit like Trevor was talking about with accommodation as well. So pinch points, on a lot of fresh produce growing areas, they will have 5 people in one large static caravan that live and work together, and they will potentially go off and work on different shifts. They'll eat in canteens at different times. They'll even travel backwards and forwards to the fields in different vehicles. And there was a lot of planning that had to go into making sure that people who lived in one caravan became, if you like, one bubble, and they became their own bubbles. And so they would live together, eat together, and work on the same shift pattern and in the same locations within workplaces wherever possible. By doing that, it was an awful lot of planning. It was an awful lot of work for a lot of the fresh produce growers, but they were able to do it. And I think also the point that was made by Trevor was there was a lot of requirement for self-reliance for some of the employees. You know, we needed them to do their bit as well. And you're right, we can put all of those plans in place, but then in the early days, you would see 15 of them all gathered together in a little smoking hut, having a cigarette, or trying to all still keep that social interaction from outside of their bubbles. And we are sociable creatures, and we need that. So there were challenges to overcome, but things like being able to plan work and adapt quickly, and to be able to change the way that businesses worked to allow those bubbles to be formed and those bubbles to remain safe and secure was something that was jumped on really, really quickly, and was able to continue throughout COVID.
That's great, thanks, Tina. So just a sort of final thought from either of our panelists, and also if you can, this is your opportunity to give a bit of a plug to your sector group. So if there are people on the call who are not connected to your sector group, perhaps you can give a shout out to your sector group, what you're doing, and just a final thought from yourself. So Tom, over to you.
Well, Tina beat me to the question there, because I was about to say something that reiterated what Trevor was covering before. The positive side for me has been the visible increase in personal responsibility from certainly our operators and supervisors. Tina referred to it as self-reliance, but I've personally witnessed operators being prepared to, shall we say, police the area where there's been too many people into a rest area, asking people to leave, keeping drivers separated, and on occasions where we've perhaps had a glut of vehicles coming in at any one time, being prepared to take responsibility and close the gates and hold vehicles back until the backlog on the terminal has started to clear. And I go back to the amount of education that's been driven into the workforce, not just our workforce, every workforce. And we're part of a very small sector, the tank storage, and we're led by a very active trade association, Tank Storage Association. Now, there seems to be that same willingness within the sector to share information as well. And it's anything that's not business critical, safety type information is seen as non-commercial, and being willing to share it. And whilst it was there before, that willingness to share information has mushroomed to the point where people are actually willing to ask questions, and people are willing to share information, not just on COVID-19, on other issues. Tina touched on statutory inspections before. We've been quite fortunate in that respect, in that most of our statutory inspections are done by one organisation, and they worked right through like ourselves. But we have had conversations with certainly the competent authority for COMA in relation to other organisations and other sectors unable to complete statutory inspections. So, you know, that level of sharing, I would hope it continues.
So is that something that we can expect from the group to promote and support for IOSH members that are part of your sector group?
Perhaps we should ask our chair, who sat on the in the background watching my performance.
Oh,
and
he's had that tip there. Thanks for that, Tom. And Trevor, same for you. Sort of final thoughts, and you know, what can IOSH members expect from, and anybody else who wants to connect with your sector group?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, stepping back and looking over the last 18 months, I think the thing that really gives me a lot of pride is the way that the industry pulled together, and not just the industry but the stakeholders. So we ran something called a pandemic steering group that was really crisis management focused, and people that attended that were operators, contractors, the supply chain, logistics, the police, the health service. So it was a great coming together, and we demonstrated that we more than one mind can sort of sort out and solve the problems. But as we look forward, I mean, we are an industry or a sector that's in transition. We've got clearly one eye on the sort of the net zero future, and I think that's what you can expect in terms of what the offshore group is trying to do, is recognise that we're evolving. So it's not just the offshore sector, and sort of the major hazard side of that we've got the sort of the aviation piece, we've got the marine, we've got extreme weather. So we're going to expand the sort of offer, if you like, and look at what the sector offers that supports both the renewables and the sort of oil and gas sector, and how we can work together on all the sort of developing the sort of new technologies that are out there, carbon capture, integrated offshore energy networks and things like that. So I think it's a really, and there might be some people out there that say that we're part of the problem, but I think we are definitely part of the solution.
And all of those things are really great examples of people may be working in different sectors, but actually what can we learn from those different sectors? And
I think we've got amazing, that's what the group's trying to offer. It's got an amazing portfolio of things that we're looking at.
Yeah, and Tina, final thoughts from you, and a big plug for RIG.
Yeah, I think my final thought, really in summing up what's happened with rural industries in throughout this time, is you should never be able to, you should never be concerned about looking back to move forward. Because some of the great things that have come out of COVID in the rural industry sector are things that happened and were within rural industries years and years and years ago, and they've come back in a different way, in a slightly better way, but they are coming back. And if you ever want a better example of that, look back to milk deliveries, because I'm seeing a big jump in the number of milkmen that are coming back. We're all having now our doorstep deliveries. So your milk, your yogurt, your cheese is all finding its way back onto your doorsteps again. And I personally think that's absolutely fantastic. And I'm happy to look back to move forward. My shameless plug for RIG is, if you haven't looked at RIG before, we are rural industries. We're not just farming, we're agriculture, we're horticulture, we've got aquaculture that we're bringing into to the team at the minute, that we've been talking to. We've got people climbing trees, cutting down trees, we've got conservation, we've got people walking across moorland. We've got diversification from, holiday accommodation through to mountain biking. So if you haven't taken a look at RIG before, please do. We're a friendly bunch. We like to engage with our members. And I hope today has given a little bit of a flavour that be it rural industries, construction, hazardous industries, offshore, we're all doing very, very similar things, and we all have something to learn from one another, and we love to learn from our members just as much as we hope they learn from us. So shameless plug for RIG. Please come and join us.
Wow, what a way to end. So yeah, I mean, the time goes massively quickly in all of these things, so which just leaves me time to say a massive thank you to Tina, Tom and Trevor, and also to Ben in the background, who's plugging away as well, and also to you, the audience, for participating. I'm sorry if I didn't quite get to your questions today, but do connect with any of the speakers via social media. Go on and have a look at the sector groups on the IOSH website. We've got loads of coronavirus content on that. Connect with them on LinkedIn. I'm sure that these days we're part of the technology is everybody's accessible. So don't forget, the final webinar in the 3-part COVID Unlock series is going to be held on Thursday, the 24th of June, and our featured panelists will be from the IOSH groups of education, environmental waste management, health and social care, and public services. So please do join us again if you can for this final webinar in the series. And do keep an eye out on the IOSH website for everything else that's going on. We're also on LinkedIn, Twitter, and just about everywhere else. So that just leaves me to say, stay safe, stay well, and goodbye. Bye.